This article is called The Old Lady Watching the Sea. Sometimes we come across a scene whose image stays with us and comes back to mind now and then. So it was on one of my frequent visits to France, to Normandy more specifically, when I visited my French friends, who invited me to come to their seaside house in Réville on the English Channel, or La Manche. They were a true French couple, stemming from the very roots of French culture. Their language perfect, their sense of humor very Gallic, his especially. The great quality of the French is that they can laugh at the world, but also at themselves. The political discord can be virulent, if not violent, but then everyone calms down, the delicious brie comes out, and un petit rouge, and all is well and friendly. It is a quality that has taken centuries to evolve and is unique. I remember when I first flew to Paris with a very proper letter of introduction from my father to his friend, a former Lithuanian regional consul, asking him to chaperone me on my trip to France. I was petrified to leave my hotel on the Boulevard Saint-Michel, but the gentleman came to pick me up, and we went on a little tour of the former Jewish quarter, Le Marais. It was not an elegant quarter, but it had a distinct character. One of the images that I remember is that of an elderly man in the street carrying a dead chicken by the neck. My father's friend bought some raspberries in a local market, and with the box of raspberries we got on the metro. People looked at us quizzically, while the gentleman said that I should eat some raspberries. I wondered if it was a Parisian custom to eat raspberries from the open box in the metro. But when in Paris, that day was my first encounter with an example of Gallic humor. Funny, light, somewhat self-deprecating, and philosophical. During our ride, the train suddenly lurched to a halt, and I stepped on a man's foot. I immediately began to apologize profusely. "Excusez-moi, monsieur." But he, very indulgently, turned to me and said quite philosophically, "Mademoiselle, si ce n'était que ça. Miss, if it were only that." To add to the charm of my first trip to Paris, his son Perkunas, tall and handsome, took me for a ride on his scooter. As he was weaving in between the cars on the Champs-Elysees, I was thrilled, but also frightened, and clung to him for dear life. He drove me up the hill to Montmartre, where artists painted tourist portraits, and we sat at a famous café called Les Cadets de Gascogne, after the famous play Cyrano de Bergerac. My escort ordered my first glass of wine in Paris, a brouilly. Today, when I taste it, the involuntary memory of my initial visit to Paris floods over me, as in the Proust episode of the tea cake, La Madeleine. My father's friend suggested that I should not just stay in Paris, but take the train south to his villa in Villefranche-sur-Mer, where his wife was hosting the son of a well-known artist, Picabia. Having overcome my initial agoraphobia, I ventured south by train. It is difficult to describe anything as beautiful as the Mediterranean. The perfectly blue water, the white and pink villas with their red slate roofs, the exotic vegetation, the houses perched some quite precariously atop hills. There is great beauty in the world, but for me it was, and still is, the most beautiful place I have ever seen. Now, just to backtrack a little, ever since I was a little girl, I loved French. The language, the sound, the flow of beautiful words, everything sounded better in French. Whether one said "sit down on the bench," which became "assieds-toi sur le banc," or "le petit chien," or un bonbon, which really meant a good. So when I was accepted at Hunter College, because I had an excellent high school average and Hunter was free for qualifying students, I immediately declared my major, French. All my immigrant friends enrolled in practical courses, which assure them jobs, biology and chemistry for the girls, engineering for the boys. But French? I heard constantly, "What are you going to do with French? How are you going to earn a living?" My answer usually was, "I don't know, but that is the only subject that I like, more precisely love." I also liked and excelled in Latin, but I would never be a true classicist. It was too dry, too cold, too old. I had dreams of becoming a simultaneous translator for the UN, but the studies were expensive, requiring a year in Switzerland. And so I took wonderful literature courses with extraordinary professors who were from the Sorbonne. I went with other French students to see French films at the Paris Theater, eating French pastries bought on Lexington Avenue, and laughed at the subtitle translations, while other spectators shushed us. Oh, those young, carefree days. French became such an integral part of my life. My best friend, a beautiful French-Moroccan girl who helped my fluency, untied my tongue, as they say, and I began to speak quite freely. With great regret, my studies ended. I attended 2 years of summer school to be able to graduate in 3 years so that I could help my parents. Life had been hard for them, having come from prosperity, then losing everything, their country, their language, their profession, their family. I was dutiful and caring and an only child. My first job at the age of 20 was in a French bank as a typist translator. I was not a good typist, only 30 words a minute, but I knew French. I was young and decorative. However, when I was told that I would have only 2 weeks for vacation, it seemed totally insufficient. I was a summer child, the beach, the sand, the water. I complained to my friend who suggested that I take the required education courses, 13 credits at night, and then apply for a teaching position. I did as she suggested, and after 10 months at the bank, I resigned my position without regret, because I learned that office work and office intrigues and politics are not for me. My French-Moroccan friend had begun teaching in a high school on Long Island a half year earlier and suggested that I apply for a teaching position in her school. And then a miracle. Without any experience, I was hired as a French, German, Latin teacher in a senior high school. Those were wonderful years. I was young, my students barely a few years younger. There were quite a few crushes from the boys, but I took myself very seriously. I accepted their admiration, but was always very proper. I subsequently earned my master's degree in French and even a PhD. It has been a rewarding, pleasurable profession, and it has never disappointed me. And now back to the title of this small essay of reminiscence. About 10 years ago, I went to Normandy to visit a couple whom I had hosted in New York. They lived in a charming small town called Saint-Lô, which had been almost destroyed by Allied bombings, except for the church steeple. My young friends, quite the atheists, said that it was just a coincidence. I did not wish to argue with my hosts. They took me to a place that I had always wanted to see, Le Mont-Saint-Michel, an abbey built on a craggy mount in the ocean between Brittany and Normandy. It was a spiritual and beautiful place surrounded by water. How the monks and people were able to hold those boulders up and build such a structure was astonishing. We heard a young woman playing the cello in one of the upper chambers, the sound reverberating throughout the abbey, the evening light streaming beams of the setting sun through the chamber. As we left the abbey and watched the tide slowly moving in to separate the abbey from the mainland, and as we turned back to look at the abbey, majestic, mysterious, resplendent, and silhouetted in the twilight, my friend said, "I wonder what one would call that." I answered without hesitation, "A homage to God." On that trip, they introduced me to their friends, an older couple, Jean-Paul and Sylvine. They had a charming small country house on a large property. Jean-Paul grew all kinds of tomatoes and vegetables and flowers. There was a chicken coop, so an abundance of fresh eggs. That evening, the wine and conversation flowed. The dinner was French and delicious. I truly believe that there is no bad food in France, except, of course, now there is that invasion of American fast food. My acquaintance with Jean-Paul and Sylvine developed into a warm relationship. I visited them again in the year after, and they visited me in New York the following year. They fell in love with the wild nature of Montauk and lobsters and East Hampton. I took them to the ballet, to the Met. We drove up to Boston, to the Norman Rockwell Museum. The French have a fascination with Norman Rockwell. I went back again the following year, and my friends drove me to see the home of Claude Monet at Giverny, where I saw the famous water lily pond. It was as perfect as if Monet had just painted it. The colors of this famous artist's home were the classical yellow and blue, which we call French blue, but in France it is simply bleu-gris or blue-gray. The year after, they surprised and charmed me with a monumental treat, a stay at the Château de Miromesnil, the birthplace of my favorite author, Guy de Maupassant, the subject of my doctoral thesis. I had never slept in a chateau, and as I walked up the polished, winding, wooden, creaking stairs, I wondered if I would be sleeping in the famous author's bedroom. I was told that I would not, but I still chose to imagine the possibility. The rooms had retained their 19th century authenticity, whitewashed walls, small windows overlooking the grounds. And the grounds, they were extraordinarily lush and beautiful. I had not slept in the author's bedroom, but I did walk the magnificent grounds where he had played as a child. I am so indebted to this wonderful couple. They showed me the wind-swept coast of Normandy and Gallic Brittany, the imposing medieval fortress city of Carcassonne, the slow, poetic, meandering Loire River with its lovely chateau. So much beauty, so much history, so much culture. Oh, mes amis, I will always be grateful to you for sharing your beautiful country with me. I believe it was in 2014 that I went with them to their house in Reville. It was a charming small row house decorated with numerous nautical objects and a huge, long garden. Jean-Paul had the proverbial green thumb. Here as well, there were so many beautiful trees, bushes, flowers, and exotic vegetation. I tried to ask him the names, but there were so many that I could not remember. Our breakfast was always café au lait, French croissant, or pain beurré with confiture, homemade, of course. Every morning, Jean-Paul would drive to the local boulanger to buy fresh bread and croissant or brioche. After breakfast, we would go to La Plage, a short walk through a narrow passage between other seaside houses. As we neared the Channel beach, we passed a house with a small garden, the second from the end, and the beach. And we saw an elderly lady standing there looking at the sea. She heard us, looked in our direction, and said sweetly, "Bonjour." We all answered, "Bonjour, madame." We went to the beach, and what a lovely beach. So calm, so quiet, no radios, no barbecues, no food vendors, just people on blankets or chairs, and children playing in the sand or building sand castles. What a cultural difference between our beaches, where you have loud music blaring, people yelling, children screaming, and those infernal smelly barbecues surrounded by not-so-thin people. The water of the Manche is quite cold, but it is not as rough as our Atlantic coast. The French are very structured, as well as aesthetically oriented. Everything is regulated. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, no snacking in between. I suppose it is a good method not to gain weight, but for me it was difficult having bad snacking habits. Towards evening, on the way back, we passed the house with the garden, and I saw that the lady was still standing there, quietly looking at the sea. We again exchanged our polite bonjour, but I was curious about her, why she was standing there almost all day just looking at the sea. Jean-Paul explained to me that her seaman husband had never returned from his fishing trip, and that the year after her son had also not returned. It gripped my heart to see this lovely old lady standing there facing those engulfing waters, so serene, so alone, against all hope, and yet still hoping for their return. I suppose that just by standing and watching the water, she felt that she had a connection with her loved ones. And thus it is that sometimes an image can stay with us and evoke different associations and emotions. As Victor Hugo wrote in his immortal poem Océano Nox, "Ô combien de marins, combien de capitaines, qui sont partis joyeux pour des courses lointaines, dans ce morne horizon se sont évanouis, combien ont disparu, dure et triste fortune, dans une mer sans fond, par une nuit sans lune, sous l'aveugle océan à jamais enfoui."